Welcome to the Spirituality of the Gospels, Week 5. This week we're going to be talking about the vision of John's Gospel. So as we know, John's Gospel is the latest Gospel written. And in the light of 60 years of reflection on the Church's vision of Jesus, John's purpose is to reveal the divinity of Christ rather than his humanity. John begins with a vision of Jesus as divine Son of God, present from the very beginning. The prologue begins, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God." John has a very specific intent in using the Greek logos, or word. Logos is the expression of God's innermost nature that created and was intimate with the world, that gives it order, and is most clearly expressed, believe it or not, in the human soul. So a better translation of this prologue might be, in the beginning, God expressed himself. Logos is the source of all truth. Where you find truth, you will find the divine logos inspiring and guiding that discovery. In the English language, words are spoken, and then, in a sense, they just fade away. But in the oral culture of John's world, the word has an actually palpable or physical reality. Once a word is spoken, it takes on life and it cannot be undone. So we could look at the Old Testament for a good example of this, and that would be the story of Isaac being fooled into giving his blessing and lands to his younger son Jacob rather than his older son Esau. Now we would say in that story that the blessing is invalid, DQ, because it was gained dishonestly. But in this culture, as the story says, Isaac's word has to stand because it has, in a sense, already taken on life. So in chapter 1, John's prologue is saying that the Logos is incarnate in a human person, who is Jesus, that God became united with us in the human reality. Jesus, as the Word, is the Creator's self-expression that makes life and is immanent in all created things. Jesus is the divine Logos, or God's spoken and enfleshed Word, the source of all truth. He doesn't teach as in Matthew, or do mighty deeds or miracles as in Mark, or show the way, as in Luke. In the Gospel of John, he is in himself the way, the truth, and the life. This is actually his identity. Early Christians believed that philosophers and prophets were actually able to express partial truths about the divine because they were also inspired by the eternal Logos. For John, throughout time, Christ, the eternal Logos, stirred the souls of humanity to seek their source and creator. In fact, John would say, we can do nothing else but seek God because that is who we are. This vision defines the disciple. So our question with John is going to be, what is happening to the disciples as they are going through this gospel? The reason is this: they are a paradigm of experiences that we have to undergo in our spiritual and psychological development. Because we are united with Jesus, the divine Logos lives in the human soul as God's image. Transformation, well, you could say divine wisdom, it only comes from looking within, not from looking outside of oneself. And we can see this exemplified in how vehemently Jesus is fighting with the teachers of the law. Knowing God can happen through this inner reality and by experience over time. The primary responsibility, or maybe you could call it a spiritual discipline of the disciple, is to see the divine truth incarnate in Jesus and living inside. The world, the law, or what is below, John would call that from below, cannot guide your soul to the truth. Only what is from above, the divine Logos, Jesus, who is the way, can light your path, but you have to see it within and know it to be your true self in order to walk that path. The great Christian mysterion, or mystery, is that the Word took on flesh. So a mystery is not really a puzzle to be solved. It's a gradual knowing, or an awareness, or a wisdom that comes from being initiated through time and experience into this way of life, and to see ourselves gradually over time through experience, our true selves, as being united with Christ. For John, the faith of the disciple is a mystery that unfolds throughout life because Jesus resides within, gradually leading us deeper and deeper into the mystery of God with us. In John, the realities of spirituality are given meaning by the inner nature of the disciple's wisdom. For example, this is why we must be free from sin's domination, because sin blinds us to the truth, prevents us from seeing our real selves, seeing inside. Seeking is important in the eyes of others, draws our vision outward. So it prevents us from seeing the Christ if we're so concerned about what others think of us. We're not paying attention to the way. In a sense, it draws our vision in the wrong direction. Judging others is another example, being concerned about what someone else is doing or not doing. John would say that is a distraction. It's focusing on what is below or outside of ourselves. This world fails to know Christ because it is so distracted. And it is our job as disciples of Jesus to give it vision, to give it sight to what is true. Jesus, as the Word, had complete consciousness of his true reality, who he was, and he gives that reality, that vision as a gift to his disciples. Now, let's look at John's Gospel and how he communicates these mystical truths. So John is divided into two parts, the Book of Signs and the Book of Glory. So we will discuss the Book of Signs in this lecture. A sign for John is not a miracle. So a miracle is, of course, a mighty deed, and you could say that it happens outside of created reality. In Mark's Gospel, Jesus performs mighty deeds or miracles. On the other hand, for John, signs are events that reveal an unseen or an internal truth, reveals what is above. John's 7 signs reveal Jesus as the eternal Logos. Before we talk about the signs, let's study a little bit the language that John uses as Jesus is gathering his disciples. This is one of my favorite things about Greek, is that it has many ways to say the same thing, and it's a very nuanced language. So John gives us, between verses 29 and 42, 4 different Greek words for to see, to emphasize the importance of the disciples having right vision. So in verse 29, the word orao, O-R-A-O, behold, the Lamb of God, refers to the impact on the observer of what is physically seen and the unseen reality that is revealed by that vision. In a sense, John is saying, let this man and who he is impress himself upon you. In verse 38, we have a second Greek word, theaomai. Jesus turns around and sees the disciples following him. This means to contemplate with great interest. Jesus saw them for their true selves and came to a knowledge of them because he truly loved them. He was interested in their lives. He says, what do you seek? So for John, this implies a spiritual hunger that leads the disciple to the truth. And the disciples respond with kind of a strange response. They say, where do you live? So to understand this dialogue appropriately, we have to see that this is actually the question of the true disciple. Where does the divine Logos actually live? It's how we start. The third Greek word is in verse 39, blepo, come and see. This word refers to kind of a neutral or an open act of seeing, kind of like lighting a candle and saying, can you see now? This is a word that invites the disciple to be open to a new vision without judgment or resistance or expectation. And finally, the word emblepo. John sees the Spirit coming upon Jesus in verse 32. And the same word is used when Jesus sees Simon in verse 42. And it means to stare hard at someone in order to understand their significance or why they would be an important person in your life. Okay, there's the Greek. Now let's move on to the 7 signs in the remainder of the book of signs. All of these signs can be seen as replacement themes. John is saying to us, in our spiritual lives, we must let go of what is below and take up what is above. The number 7 in Hebrew numerology represents Sabbath, or the day of rest, on which the Jews remembered who they were. For Jews, to forget who you are, your role in creation is to bring the world into darkness by disrupting Yahweh's order. By using the 7 signs, readers are asked to remember who we truly are. Do not forget yourself. In each sign, an external law in the Jewish tradition is actually replaced by an internal law. John is, through his stories in the book of signs, replacing Jewish rituals, the temple, institutions, social norms, feast, and religious prejudices with the inner truth of the divine Logos, God's Spirit revealed in Jesus, the way. So let's look at these signs. The first sign is the wedding feast at Cana in chapter 2. Now, it begins with on the 3rd day. It's interesting to note that in Genesis chapter 1, on the 3rd day, is the moment when the Creator separates the water from the earth so that fruit can grow. In the Cana sign, jars for Jewish purification rites are replaced with the wine of salvation, which is, of course, the symbol of the kingdom of God. This sign says that the disciples must separate what is from above, which is the wine of salvation, from what is from below, which is the water, in order that we can bear fruit. The second sign is a cleansing of the temple. Now, it's interesting to note that in other Gospels, this story is placed at the end of the Gospel to bring about Jesus' arrest and death. But in John's Gospel, the cleansing of the temple is such an important sign that it's moved to the second sign of the 7 in the beginning, chapter 2, verse 13. So the Jewish temple is the center of truth, but it is replaced by Jesus' body. The external center of worship and wisdom, which is the temple, loses its meaning in the presence of Christ, the divine Logos, and the center of worship in himself. And also the disciple who carries Christ within him. So the cleansing of the temple has a number of different meanings, one of which is a deep sense by the disciple of our own holiness, that within our own souls we carry a place of worship because we are one with the Christ. The third story or sign is Jesus' very long conversation with Nicodemus. In chapter 3, Nicodemus comes to Jesus at night, which we know now from looking at the images of darkness and light in this gospel. He is in the darkness. He is the disciple who is asking sincere questions and is seeking the truth within. In this sign, birth into a chosen people, which is Nicodemus, is replaced with the disciple who's born from above in water and the Spirit. So Nicodemus represents the sign of the new disciple. The fourth sign is the Samaritan woman in chapter 4. This story redefines who the disciple is and where we worship. The woman represents Jews living outside of Jerusalem who intermarried and were not allowed to worship in the temple. It's interesting to note that these Jews lived in an area where the gods were worshipped on 5 mountains or holy sites. So when the Samaritan woman when Jesus says, "You have 5 husbands and the one you have now is not your own," he's highlighting the fact that she represents a group of people that has been anathema, rejected by the people of God, which are the Jews. So the sign of the Samaritan woman is saying, no, these are true disciples who worship in spirit and in truth. Worship does not happen in the right place, but in truth. Number 5 is the second Cana sign, the healing of the royal official's son. This sign is a replacement of human authority with heavenly authority. Number 6, the healing on the Sabbath, which is one of the times that Jesus really gets into it with the Pharisees and the leaders of his own religious tradition. In chapter 5, the Sabbath of law is replaced with the Sabbath of healing. The synagogue leaders attack Jesus for healing, and the man for carrying his mat on the Sabbath. And Jesus' response to them is, "My Father is at work now, and so I must be at work as well." So not only does Jesus break the Sabbath by healing, but he claims God as Father. And this is a moment that absolutely enrages the teachers of the law, that he has made God his Father in the same breath as breaking the Sabbath. In a sense, you could say the teachers of the law were probably seeing him as somebody who had completely forgotten his place in the universe, his place in creation, because he has broken worship with that day on which Jews remembered who they were in God's creation. The last sign is the feeding of the 5,000 and brings us to the bread of life discourse. So in this, very briefly, Jesus is the new Moses, and he is replacing the Passover with the bread of his own body. Eucharist replaces the manna in the desert, and John is saying we are entering into a time of a new exodus, going from slavery, or what is below, to freedom, or what is above. So that's John's gospel. So to conclude, John's gospel gives us an image of Jesus as divine logos with us from the very beginning. But most importantly, the disciple is someone who carries that divine logos, that center of truth, the face of Jesus inside of our own hearts and souls, and that our challenge is to replace ourselves, all of the things that we do in our lives, with that which gives us that new vision, as we saw in the call of the disciples at the beginning of the Book of Signs. So thank you so much for joining us on this study. We'll see you next time.